Hello and welcome back. We're on chapter 21 of Not by Sight. As you may recall, Grace is still languishing in prison under some serious interrogation from some higher-ups in the government. And Jack has decided to try to do what he can to get her out, along with the help from her friends. Here we go. Claire felt the late afternoon heat against her back as she pitched more hay into the noisy baler's chute. A few feet away, Agnes tied off the bales with wire while Becky, Lucy, and Mr. Tillman offloaded and weighed the bundles before stacking them onto the cart. Tomorrow was the last day of haymaking, and everyone pitched in, except for Mrs. Vance, who had taken over Grace's duties of record-keeping. "That's the last of this batch," Claire called, tossing in a final forkful. "We'll finish baling the dried windrows over on the west side tomorrow and then take the last shipment to the station on Wednesday." "Lucy's leaving for Stonebrook that day, so who gets to go to Margate?" Becky shouted over the baler. "I want to see my family before we go south for the next job." "Mrs. Vance is sending Claire," Lucy said after turning off the baler's motor. "I'll be taking the train out of Canterbury, so Mr. Tillman is going along with her and Agnes." Claire leaned the pitchfork against the baler and removed her sweat-stained hat. She walked to the drinking barrel set up beside the cart. "Could it get any hotter than this? I'll burn like morning kindling if this keeps up." She wiped at the perspiration beaded along her brow and slapped the hat back into place. "I really wanted to go this time," Becky continued to complain as she moved another bale around. "I need to see your family. Yes, we know, Becky," Claire said crossly. "Just be glad you have one." Claire, are you all right?" Lucy asked. Claire shot her a hostile look, then ladled a cupful of the water. Daisy's not in Canterbury after all. She'd met with Mr. Pittman, the private investigator, that morning in the village. He'd given her the news he'd received bad information. Her daughter wasn't anywhere near the area. Without looking at them, Claire took a drink, then said, "It seems I have to start a new search." "Oh, Claire, I'm sorry," Agnes said as she and Lucy approached. Claire saw Mr. Tillman offer a sympathetic nod, though he remained back and removed his hat. Becky stood off in the distance, sulking. "Daisy could still be here in Kent," Lucy said. "Grace would tell you to have faith and you'll find her." Claire took another drink of water, then sighed. "She would, wouldn't she? Has anyone heard anything?" "We were going to ask you." Lucy took her turn at the ladle. Claire glanced at Agnes. "I saw you at the post office this morning, Pierpont. Did you receive any news?" Agnes had removed her gloves, scratching at her fingers. When she looked up again, she wet her lips and said, "I mailed a letter, but not to Grace. I wrote the assistant manager at Swan's. Since Mr. Mabry has been arrested, Grace's father was arrested as well?" Claire's gaze narrowed. "How do you know?" Agnes tilted her chin, and Claire could swear she looked afraid. "I'm sure Lord Roxwood mentioned it on Saturday. Anyway, I wish to find out about my back wages." Claire eyed her with disgust. "I'm surprised at you, Agnes Pierpont. Poor Grace and her father languish in prison, their very lives hang in the balance, and you're worried about a few shillings owed to you as a maid? A woman's got to live, doesn't she?" As Agnes spoke, she turned a bright hue while she continued scratching at her hands. "Come on, ladies, let's finish weighing these bales and get them onto the cart. I'm ready for some supper." Mr. Tillman put his hat back on and released a bale from the scale before moving to set another in its place. "We'll cover the whole thing with a tarp and start again first thing in the morning." Claire glanced at Lucy, then to Becky, who seemed over her brooding now. Each of them shook their heads, clearly disappointed. Of all people, they would have thought Agnes most loyal to Grace. particularly after the maid shared her story with Lord Roxwood. She practically owed Grace Mabry her life. Then Claire recalled being chided by Grace for being too quick to judge others, like Sir Marcus Weatherford. And just look at what had happened. She frowned as she went to help the others weigh the last of the bales. It seemed her friend had been wrong about Agnes Pierpont, too. Let's have a look, shall we? Jack sat on the divan while Dr. Strom flashed the ophthalmoscope in front of his eyes. Remarkable, simply remarkable, Strom said after a moment. He leaned back in his chair across from Jack and pocketed the instrument. When I examined you before, Lord Roxwood, I didn't detect any damage to the retina, but the speed at which you've recovered is amazing. Congratulations. Jack drawled. Yes, now I can look in the mirror and see the brute staring back at me. I said before, your wounds are still healing. You will have scars, but the swelling and coloring will fade. And those injuries were hard won, he added quietly. I imagine, with you being a relative of the Mabry family, New Scotland Yard put you through your paces, Jack said. I was a guest at the precinct in Westminster over the weekend, Lord Roxwood. His tone was sharp. Fortunately, they weren't too interested in a country doctor who had spent most of his years living in rural Kent. Thanks to some, they have more important suspects to torment. Jack took a deep breath. I am sorry about Grace, Miss Mabry. But the proof is undeniable, as I'm sure you're already aware. I don't believe it! Strom launched from his chair to pace the carpeted floor. That girl is as sweet as her mother ever was, and more heartsick than I can tell you about her brother's disappearance. He spun to face Jack. Why in heaven's name would she risk Cullen's life by selling out secrets to the enemy? Why would her father, for that matter? He began to pace again. I'm no detective, but something else is at play here. If it makes you feel better, I agree. In fact, I have my friend at the Admiralty looking into it. Marcus had called him back yesterday, and Jack felt relieved Grace was still in one piece. He'd even been optimistic to learn Agnes Pierpont had borrowed her stationery and posted the incriminating letter. Yet they lacked any real proof to connect her to the deed. Strom, how well do you know the women working for the WFC? I'm particularly interested in Miss Mabry's maid, Agnes Pierpont. Strom looked surprised. I don't know her well at all, though she is a patient of mine. He held up his palms. She's got some kind of rash on her hands. The skin is irritated, and she's scratched at them so much they've begun to bleed. I bandaged them for her this morning before I came to see you. Why? What did she get into? She said she was handling fertilizer without gloves. Dr. Strom shrugged. It doesn't have the look of stinging nettles or gorse, although I can't rule it out. Did she say when she contracted this rash? Sunday, I believe. Jack shook his head, perplexed. Sorry, I'm not much help. Strom moved to grab for his black bag. You're healing well, Lord Roxwood. I can call on you again in a couple of weeks, but I think at this point it's unnecessary, unless some problem arises. I appreciate you keeping the news about my sight confidential, Jack said. He stood and extended his hand. I'm not yet ready to publicize it. I don't understand your reasons, your lordship, but I will respect your wishes. The two shook hands. Thank you, Jack said. You once told me to have faith my sight would return. I didn't want to believe it. The physician arched a brow. And now? Jack smiled. I'm beginning to. Then he sobered and said, I'll do everything in my power to help Grace. I just don't know how. With faith, son, Dr. Strom said. In the end, the truth always wins out. Now I know where Grace gets it from. The doctor shook his head. Lillian Mabry was my uncle's daughter and had faith to rival the angels. I'm sure Grace inherited that good trait from her mother. Jack watched as Strom departed before he replaced the mask and went into his study to telephone Marcus. How is she today? He asked his friend. She's doing rather well, given the circumstances. I think her temper holds her in good stead with Cromwell. I tell you, Jack, except for that confounded letter, even I'd believe her innocent. She didn't write that code, Jack said, his jaw set. We just need to prove it. Did you learn any more about Agnes Pierpont? I don't want to get your hopes up, but after talking with Grace on Sunday, I started censoring all mail going in and out of Roxwood, Marcus said. A letter postmarked yesterday from Agnes Pierpont was being sent to the attention of Mr. Alfred Dykes at Swan's in London. In the letter, she asks about her back wages. Jack leaned against the desk. That sounds a bit cold, wouldn't you say? A far cry from the teary-eyed performance I witnessed at the gatehouse. What do you make of it? I agree it's odd, Marcus said. But we used heat on the letter and didn't come up with anything other than what she'd written, so it seems legitimate. Jack scoured his mind for inconsistencies. An idea began to form, and he asked, Marcus, aside from lemon juice and the like, are there other types of invisible ink? Before my accident, I remember a report about the enemy starting to use chemical-based substances. Correct, Marcus said. Room 40 recently began using spectroscopy to decipher some of the inks. He paused. What are you thinking? Jack relayed to him the conversation with Strom about Agnes Pierpont's rash. He claims she got it from the fertilizer, but why wouldn't she have worn gloves? We recently heard the Germans are using sodium nitrate, though it's relatively new. Marcus's tone took on an excited edge. It's soaked into clothing, a tie, a scarf, a handkerchief, so it can be transported without detection. It reactivates with water. The person need only wet the cloth and wring out the moisture to be used as invisible ink. Sodium nitrate can irritate the skin, and it's found in fertilizer. When did the rash occur? Sunday. Jack's pulse raced. Marcus, do you suppose? Very possibly, his friend said. Got to ring off now, old boy. I've some investigating to do. I'll get back as soon as I can. Then he abruptly hung up. Jack carefully replaced the telephone's receiver, seized with a rush of excitement. Grace might be exonerated. He strode from his study with new purpose. He planned to do some investigating of his own. I still don't understand why I'm not allowed to go to the Margate, Becky Simmons complained as the women dressed for their last day of work. Not another word, Simmons. Claire shot her a warning glance while she cinched the belt at her trousers. Shrugging into her trench coat, she added, I'm tired of listening to you go on. We can't all have what we want, you know. Becky glared at her while Lucy flashed a look of sympathy that only fueled Claire's anger. She was sorry she'd ever mentioned Daisy to any of them. She didn't need their pity. What are you two looking at? We've got work to do. Easy for you to say, Danner, Becky said. You'll get to go right past my family's village while I have to stay here. Claire was surprised to see tears in Becky's eyes. What's wrong with you? Are you still homesick? The woman shook her head and continued dressing. Claire relented and said, Look, if it were up to me, Simmons, I'd let you go. But Mrs. Vance is our supervisor, and she gives the orders. When Becky said nothing, Claire sat to lace up her boots. She glanced over at Agnes, who scratched at her hands through her gloves. Still have that rash, Pierpont? Agnes nodded. I changed the bandages, but the sulfur the doctor gave me doesn't seem to be working. I've never had such a reaction before, Claire scrutinized her. You must have very sensitive skin. What were you doing handling fertilizer on Sunday anyway? It was our day off. Agnes paled. I met with Mr. Tillman. He asked if I wanted to make extra, taking care of Lord Roxwood's rose garden. She tipped her chin. I could use the money. Yes, a woman's got to live, right? Claire said, tossing Agnes's words back at her. She thought again about the letter Agnes had mailed on Monday and fumed. In truth, she would rather go to Margate with Becky. At least Simmons was grateful to Grace for her help, unlike this one who seemed more interested in getting paid her back wages than in the fate of her mistress. Breakfast! Mrs. Vance poked her head through the bedroom doorway and beamed. I cooked up eggs and a bit of sausage for our last day, ladies, so let's make the most of it. Once the women finished dressing, they headed downstairs. Seated at the kitchen table minutes later, Claire looked over at their supervisor and wondered what the future had for Mrs. Vance. If they were all to move south, what of her budding romance with Mr. Tillman? She soon had her answer. I suppose I should tell you all now. Mrs. Vance's features had taken on a glow. I'll be staying on at Roxwood as Mrs. George Tillman. Several gasps rose from the table before the kitchen echoed with a resounding cheer and a flurry of congratulations. Mrs. Vance laughed and suddenly seemed years younger. Yes, he's asked me to be his wife, she said. My friend, Millicent Foster, is in need of a few extra hands in her gang, so you'll meet with her at the Mortimer estate tomorrow and take up the task of showing those women how it's done. Her eyes held a suspicious gleam. I've already told her how proud I am of all of you. Not only have you done exemplary work, but you've shown each other respect and teamwork. I couldn't have asked for a finer game of women in all the Corps. Less than a half hour later, hugs were exchanged and a few tears shed before Claire and Agnes made their way outside and down to the barn, where the horse cart was loaded and waiting. I think congratulations are in order, Claire called as she spied Mr. Tillman adjusting the tack on the horses. He looked up and colored, but his broad smile spoke volumes. You will take good care of our supervisor, won't you? She asked once she and Agnes climbed into the cart. For the rest of my life, he said solemnly. His words pierced her. In her heart of hearts, Claire had hoped one day to share that with Marcus. Mr. Tillman eased the team forward. Claire let go of the thought as she looked back to see Lucy and Becky walking toward the barn while Mrs. Vance stood near the doors. They all waved, and she raised a hand to them in return. She'd said her goodbyes to Lucy, who would be gone by the time she returned. Claire realized how much her WFC sisters had come to mean to her, and was thankful for their support and encouragement. Like her, they believed Grace would soon be free. They also believed Claire would find Daisy. She turned back to face the road ahead, feeling renewed determination. She must keep that belief also. Jack remained concealed between two lilac bushes growing alongside the gatehouse wall and waited nearly an hour until the last of the women left. Entering the women's quarters, he climbed the stairs and proceeded to make a search of the bags and boxes beneath each bed. 15 minutes later, he found what he was after. Having learned about Agnes Pierpont's family from Marcus, he plucked a photograph from the bag beneath one of the beds near the window and surmised he'd found her possessions. He emptied the rest of the bag's contents onto the bed, but after an extensive search through various articles of clothing, toiletries, and stationery, he came up with nothing. Had they been wrong? So far, Agnes Pierpont had turned out to be exactly what she'd seemed, a domestic who put on a good show, but in the end worried more about wages than her mistress, a citified field worker who had forgotten to wear gloves before handling fertilizer. The woman who had been Grace's one hope. He stared at the empty bag, and for the second time he prayed for a miracle, some shred of evidence he'd overlooked. He was no magician to pull a rabbit out of a hat, though, unless Agnes Pierpont was a well-seasoned spy. He plunged his hand inside the bag, his fingers searching for a false bottom or hidden compartment. A moment later, he smiled. Jack took off at a half-run back to the manor with his proof in hand. He'd no sooner closeted himself into the study and picked up the telephone than Knowles rapped at the door. "Sir Marcus Weatherford has arrived, my lord." "Excellent. Show him in." Jack waited until his friend entered the study. "I was about to call you. I found something." He bent down to retrieve Agnes Pierpont's bag from the floor. "I'll go first." Marcus closed the study door and moved toward the desk. "After I spoke with you last night, I contacted our people in the War Office. We have this remarkable woman who has a real knack for deciphering various mediums used in making invisible ink. Maud was able to detect the sodium nitrate and make visible the code used in Agnes Pierpont's letter to Alfred Dykes. Early this morning, New Scotland Yard sent 2 detectives over to Swans." He eyed Jack with barely concealed excitement. "And guess what? I'm on tenterhooks." Jack said, his heart hammering in his chest. They searched the floor manager's rooms and found code books, also maps of our naval yards, directives written in German and Dutch, and a healthy supply of sodium nitrate. When he was confronted, Dykes confessed all. It seems he and his agents have been using Patrick Mabry and Swans to transmit classified British naval secrets to the enemy. Mabry couldn't have known the people he was corresponding with were put in place by the Germans for precisely that reason. His letters would be unsealed, coated with invisible ink, and resealed to be forwarded on to those contacts. Marcus's brown eyes gleamed. The letter to James Heron you found aboard the Laconia is just such an example. And it was Agnes Pierpont who gave that letter to Chaplin the night of the ball, not Grace. She's innocent, and so is her father. Jack felt as though the sun had just come out. Relief and elation filled him. He grabbed the bag and thrust it at Marcus. Take a look. Marcus peered into the bag, then reached in to remove a code book, several sheets of stationery, a photograph, and lastly, a neatly folded handkerchief. Agnes Pierpont's possessions, Jack said. I took the liberty of searching their quarters. As you can see, those sheets of stationery have brown markings, lemon juice. No doubt she was practicing her craft. The code book speaks for itself, but you'll see in the photograph what appears to be barbed wire behind the women. Marcus nodded, looking grim. According to Alfred Dykes, these two are Agnes Pierpont's mother and sister. They're being held at a concentration camp in Germany. It would explain why she felt compelled to spy for the enemy. I feel certain she was being blackmailed. He held up the handkerchief. And this? I would guess it contains the sodium nitrate she used in her letter to Dykes. I need to get back to London, Marcus said, replacing the contents in the bag. Any idea where she is? Down at the farm, I imagine. Let's take my car. Minutes later, Marcus's Pierce Arrow pulled up alongside the barn. Mrs. Vance came outside and appeared shocked when Jack, still wearing his mask, strode directly up to her and addressed her. We're here to see Agnes Pierpont. She's not here, my lord, the woman stammered. Agnes is with Claire Danner and Mr. Tillman. They've taken the last load of hay into Margate and should be at the train station by now. Let's go. Marcus led the way back to the car. Once they were on their way to Margate, Jack said, When will the Mabrys be released from New Scotland Yard? He wondered if Grace would ever forgive him. Perhaps once she learned of his help in bringing Agnes Pierpont to justice. He had treated her father abominably, though all indications at the time proved Patrick Mabry's guilt. Would Grace understand? Jack didn't dare to hope. They're still at the precinct in Westminster, but I'm certain with the new evidence it will be only a day or two before they're free to go, Marcus said. I will tell you I'm relieved about the turn of events, more than you can know. I haven't seen or spoken with Claire Danner since the day after the dance, and frankly, I've been afraid to. He shot Jack a grimace. She and Grace are close, and no doubt I'm being blamed for taking her friend off to jail. I hope once we've sorted this business and Grace is released, Claire will still be amenable to my courtship. Jack turned to him. You really are keen on her, aren't you? He said softly. Enough to imagine a future with her, Marcus said. Then he flashed a humorless smile. But one step at a time, old boy. I haven't exactly won her affection yet. They had just passed through the village of Reston, a couple of miles from town, when overhead Jack heard the whine of plane engines. Marcus, do you hear? Marcus slowed the vehicle and glanced up. Dear God, no, he said. A formation of German Gotha planes was flying up from the south and heading into Margate. They began dropping bombs. Marcus floored the accelerator. Claire! Moments later, explosions rent the air. Black smoke rose against the horizon. Scant minutes later, the Pierce Arrow entered town, and the 2-minute men witnessed the devastation and destruction. The enemy planes had disappeared, having dropped their bombs. Buildings lay in rubble. Fires burned out of control in various places. Cars had been overturned, and the bodies. Marcus! Jack pointed toward the train station, where a huge inferno blazed. The hay! It's on fire! The road was blocked with debris. Marcus braked the car and they exited, rushing forward on foot. Unconcerned for their safety, the two approached the station to search out the three from Roxwood. Others who had managed to remain safe now rushed from houses and buildings and began rescuing victims of the attack. 12 men, railway personnel, and a few shopkeepers hauled buckets of water to try to douse the flames while shouting for the fire department. Jack and Marcus found Mr. Tillman first, his leg crushed beneath a large timber several yards from the burning cart. Where is Claire? Marcus grabbed the injured farmer by the collar. Easy. Jack pressed a hand to his friend's shoulder. He'd never seen Marcus look so wild with fear. The blast, Mr. Tillman groaned. Over there. The farmer pointed to a cratered outbuilding near the station. Marcus started to leave, but Jack said, Quick, let's get this beam off of him. They freed the farmer's leg just as two other men approached to offer their assistance. Come on, let's go, Marcus urged. They'll take care of him. Jack followed his friend as they ran to the outbuilding. Claire! Marcus shouted, and Jack caught a glimpse of black hair amidst the rubble. She sat on the ground beneath a foot of debris, leaning against the building's one undamaged wall. Though her midnight hair was discernible beneath the concrete dust, the rest of her looked disheveled. Claire! Marcus leaped over the pile of wreckage and knelt down beside her. Jack moved to her other side. Agnes Pierpont was there as well, her head lying motionless in Miss Danner's lap. She saved me. Claire Danner blinked at Marcus, looking dazed. Tears streaked her dusty cheeks. Agnes jumped in front of me when the block flew at us. With a shaking hand, she pointed to a cinder block that had once been part of the building. After the bomb, she saved me. She pursed her lips and looked down at the woman in her lap, who appeared to be sleeping. Gently, she brushed back a tendril of the dusty, dark hair. She said to tell Grace, to tell her she was sorry. She began to cry, and as Jack reached to gently remove Agnes from her lap, Marcus swept Claire up into his arms. Oh, sweetheart, I was so afraid I'd lost you, he groaned against her hair. When I saw the hay burning, I thought... Marcus pressed Claire close, and Jack realized what he wanted. Love. Passionate, steadfast, unending. Love that could see beyond his scars to the heart of the man within. The joy he felt whenever he was with Grace. He carried the body of Agnes Pierpont to a cart set up to take the dying and injured to the hospital. While Mr. Tillman's leg was being tended, along with Miss Danner's cuts and bruises, he and Marcus spent the next several hours doing their best to help the townspeople of Margate clear away debris and put out fires. It didn't occur to Jack until later that no one remarked on his mask or gave his appearance a second glance. They had more important issues to deal with, life and death. Thank you for reading with me today. Stay tuned for the next few chapters.